You'll be turning in your Bibles to Esther, chapter 9 and 10. And tonight we'll complete the study of that book and be ready for the test Wednesday night. Okay? And of course, we're doing this for our young people, so they'll be ready for that Bible bowl. And they're the ones paying the closest attention, aren't they? That's right. Okay, good. Let's take one more look at the memory work. Esther 6 and verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? Esther 7 and verse 9. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hanging thereon. Esther 8 and verse 5. And said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. Esther 9 and verse 4. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went throughout all the provinces. But this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. And then the two not related to Esther, John 8:24. I said therefore unto you that ye shall die in your sins, for if ye believe not that I am he, ye shall die in your sins. And then Mark 16:16. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. Okay, now let's look at the last two chapters of the book of Esther. It's been a good story so far. I don't mind admitting to you, there's things in these last two chapters that just give me pause and trouble me, and we'll get to them as we get on into this. And we will see. Just remember this. The Bible tells us what happened. That does not always necessarily imply God's total approval of what happened. It's just the story of what happened. And we have to take the whole Bible context and the whole of Bible teaching to bring that to bear to determine, did God really approve of everything that's happening here? So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this story. Esther 9 and verse 1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell on all the people. Quite a turn of events, didn't it? And notice how I've got it highlighted here. It was turned to the contrary. Now that's a passive statement. Where's the active agent? And again, this is one of the places where God is in the shadows of the book of Esther. God's the one that turned this to the contrary. And that's going to show up again later in this chapter, how things have been turned around. And I want you to remember now as we read through this book that even though He's not mentioned, God is on every page. Now let's see what happens next. all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because of the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. See, Mordecai, he's second only to the king now, so all the lieutenants and deputies under him, they know who's boss. And so by fear of Mordecai, they're going to help the Jews. The memory verse, for Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. We discussed in class what we mean by waxed. That's not polishing the floors or shining the car, that's not what it means. Now, he may have had a shiny chariot, but it wasn't because he waxed it. Wax means he grew. We talk about the moon waxing and waning. And so Mordecai became greater and greater in the kingdom in his influence. That's what it means when it says waxed. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. Now this is the part that starts to trouble me, and it gets even worse through the book of Esther. Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount, ye have heard it said by them of old, that thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. Now, you go through the Old Testament and you don't find where the Old Testament says that. We got to remember on the Sermon on the Mount what Jesus is doing. He is correcting what they had heard that had been said and showing the superiority of the new that was to come. But everything wasn't necessarily interpreted correctly as they had heard that it was. So where do they get the idea in the Old Testament that you're supposed to hate your enemy? It's been suggested maybe it's because of stories like this, where the Jews went out and slaughtered their enemies. And so therefore, those who thought, those scribes and teachers and rabbis that thought they were so great said, aha, then we're to hate our enemies. But Jesus says to love your enemies, to do good to them that hate you, and to pray for them that despitefully use you. And really that idea of loving your enemies, that's one of the hallmark virtues of Christianity, isn't it? Well, you're not going to see that in this chapter. In fact, it gets bloodier and worse as we go through. Notice the next verse. Now this is the tongue twister, okay? And in Shushan the palace, the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. Now here comes the tongue twisters. And Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Poratha, and Adalia, and Aradatha, and Parmashta, and Arissa, and Aradiah, and Vajizatha. Well, that's pretty good. Remember the rule. If you're reading a word and you don't know how to say it loud, all right? And people will think you know what you're saying here. And so I've got a self-pronouncing Bible that helps me with those words a little bit, but that's quite the tongue tangler. Who are these people we're mentioning? Well, they're the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, and they slew those 10 sons. And I'm reminded of how Haman had been bragging on his many children. You remember that when he's talking about how great he had become in his many children? And now all 10 of his sons have been put to death. But notice how it says this, but on the spoil they laid not their hand. The king's decree was that they could kill the Jews and take their spoil. And then he said, but now Jews, you can defend yourself. And the Jews went out and slew their enemies, but they didn't take the spoil. And in the margin of my Bible, I write that they were out for blood and not for bounty. And so in Shushan the palace, they had killed 500 of these. And among those, or in addition to those, are the 10 sons of Haman. Verse 11. On that day, the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request further? And it shall be done. It's almost as though the king is asking, you want any more dead? And notice Esther's response. Then Esther said, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow according to all and to this day's decree. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. Now remember, that gallows that Haman made was 50 cubits high. And now these 10 sons are already dead. But what are they going to do? Well, they're going to string them up and hang them high just so people can see that they're dead and put it up as a display. Sounds sort of cruel, doesn't it? Well, you watch this. In verse 14, and the kings commanded it to be so done, and the decree was given in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. But the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan. But on the prey they laid not their hand. 500 the first day, 300 the second day, 800 men they slew. But again it says they didn't touch their goods. They didn't lay their hands on the prey. But that's not all. The other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. 3 times it tells us they did not take the spoils. They didn't take the goods of those they slew. But now 75,000 that are dead. That's quite a massacre that took place by the hands of the Jews against their enemies. Now, I don't really like that. It may be I don't understand what's happened here. I know God has used armies and people to use His wrath against those that have violated His will, and it may be that every one of these 75,000 were so guilty of something that they were worthy of death, and this is how God is destroying them. I understand that, but the Jews in doing this seem to enjoy their blood. And then I want you to, as we keep reading, I want you to see how they keep rejoicing and rejoicing in this. Verse 17. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested they, and made it a day of feasting and of gladness. Verse 18. But the Jews that were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and of gladness. In verse 19, therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and a sending portions one to another. Okay, I understand. But remember the weeping and the wailing they did? They thought they were the ones that were going to be put to death. But now the way the events has turned, the enemies have been put to death. And surely there'd be an emotional release from that when you think you're facing death, but now those that were going to kill you are dead, and so there'd be cause for rejoicing. This rejoicing goes on, and the massacre is great, and the blood was awful that was shed, wasn't it? And look at this. Mordecai wrote all these things. When we first started studying the book of Esther, someone asked, who wrote the book of Esther? And at the time I said, well, I don't know that we know, but now maybe we do. Mordecai wrote these things. It could be that we have the book of Esther because of the things that Mordecai had written. But not just Mordecai, I'll show you in just a moment. But Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews that were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly. And the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. Well, what's that sound like? Well, we have a day like that. It's not based on a massacre, I'm glad, but we have Christmas, don't we? I mean, isn't Christmas a time of feasting and joy and giving gifts to each other? And there's always seems like a heightened interest in taking care of the poor around the Christmas time. And you know how that Christmas season makes you feel? I mean, I've already heard some Christmas carols on the radio, and I know it's early, but it already starts sounding kind of good. You know, the memories you have of Christmas. The Jews around the world to this day still celebrate these days, and they have that same feeling about this because of the associations that they've had with this. And this falls right before the Passover week in their yearly calendar. They'll have these days of Purim, and then they have the Passover week. And so there's this great day of great rejoicing and giving gifts and care for the poor. At this end of the story, at this end of the Bible story of their deliverance, and then the week follows, they remember their first deliverance out of Egypt. I just think that's kind of interesting how they keep those customs in that manner. Verse 23. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them. Because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. I want you to remember that. The days of Purim, because he had cast Pur. And we're not exactly sure that was, but we know what a lot was. It was some kind of random way of making a selection, either drawing straws or maybe throwing stones or letting a pole fall a certain way, and there are different ways that they had of doing this. But when Haman had cast his lot, he had cast his lot to select this day, and it was the day the Jews were to be destroyed, and it wound up being the day the enemies of the Jews were destroyed. But the very idea of casting the lot is casting the case into the hand of God. The proverb is Proverbs 16:33. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. And so when you think of the days of Purim, the very fact that the days have that name ought to remind us God was behind the story of the book of Esther. And when they called these days days of Purim, after the name of Pur, therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, that it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. I didn't highlight it, but I want you to notice where it says, upon all such as joined themselves to them. Remember the end of chapter 8, how many of the people of the land became Jews because of the triumph of the Jews in this matter. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, in every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Now notice verse 29. Then Esther the queen the daughter of Ahab, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. We'd already read that Mordecai had written these things, and now we see that Esther the queen herself writes some of these things. And so it may be, I'll just say it may be, that the part of the book of Esther is written by Esther herself. And if it is, that's the only part of the Bible that we know of that was written by a woman. I think that's kind of interesting. All right? Verse 30. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with the words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fasting and of their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book, which very likely is this book of Esther that we've been studying. And now we come to chapter 10. And I want to give you a little piece of Bible trivia. It was in the 13th century. That's in the 1200s. That some men got together and divided the Bible into the chapters that we now have. And so sometime, you're reading the Bible and there's a chapter division where you think, well, they shouldn't have divided it there. The thought rolls right through the chapter, and you may have divided it a little different if you've done it. The chapter divisions are not given to us by God. It's a tool of man to help us find our place around in the Scriptures. Now that's so for every book except the book of Psalms. Every one of those 150 Psalms are given by the Holy Spirit as an individual psalm. And we will often say things like Psalm chapter 1 or Psalm chapter 23 or something, and that's really not the correct way to say it, because the Psalms are not chapters. When we announce the song numbers, you say turn to number 1. We don't say turn to your song book to chapter 1, do we? No, we just mean the first song in the book is what we're talking about. And that's the way the book of Psalms are. Now, if you count the book of Psalms in this, the shortest chapter in the Bible is Psalm 118. But it's not really a chapter. If you take the Psalms out of the picture, the shortest chapter in the Bible is Esther chapter 10. And I think it's interesting that the longest verse, which is Esther 8 and verse 9, and the shortest chapter, Esther 10, is both in the same book. You remember 8, 9, 10. Okay? Chapter 8 and verse 9 is the longest verse in the Bible. And chapter 10, Esther chapter 10, is the shortest chapter in the Bible. If you don't count the Psalms, which really you shouldn't. But let's read this chapter. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the destruction and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto the king Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. It's as though Mordecai became a second Joseph. You remember the story of Joseph, how he'd risen from being a slave in Egypt to being the second in command of all of Egypt. And now here Mordecai has risen to be second in command of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And he's looking after his people the way that Joseph had done. Now that's the story of Esther. I want to review quickly these 7 points that point to the providence of God in Esther. We'll read these words in Esther 1:1, 2:8, 3:4, and 5:1. Now it came to pass, those passive terms. But somebody's making this come to pass. Behind those words, now it came to pass, is God. It's sort of like saying it just so happened. But God is the one making these things happen. Number 2 is the feast of Pur and Purim, the casting of the lots. And as we looked at the proverb, the disposing thereof is of the Lord. Number 3, you have the fast. You remember when Esther said, I'll go to the king, but you tell the people to fast for me. Well, why would they fast for her? Well, fasting under the old law is often associated with prayer. And though prayer is not mentioned in the book of Esther, the fast would imply the prayer. And so they're beseeching God to help Esther before she goes before the queen. And then we read this. Mordecai said to Esther, then shall enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. And who knoweth whether thou art come into the kingdom for such a time as this? The words, behind those words is Mordecai's faith in God, that the people would be preserved. And it may be that Esther has been put in this very position to make sure that happens. And notice how he says, who knoweth? And there's so much about the providence of God we don't know. We might think, well, it was by God's providence that such and such happened. But we need to say it like Mordecai did, it may be, or like Paul did, perhaps, when he was talking to Philemon about Onesimus. Perhaps he came away that ye might receive him forever. And so we know that God works in His providence. But when it comes to identifying any specific event, we need to be humble. Realize perhaps that was so. But perhaps we might be surprised someday if we ever find out just where it is that God's invisible hand intervened in our lives. Number 5. It says, if this is what Haman's wife said, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. See, as Haman's humiliation began, she recognized somebody bigger than us is running this thing, and this is all going to come against us. And so that'd be pointing to God, wouldn't it? And then in verse 6, where we read twice in chapter 9, it was turned to the contrary. So that's how God's providence works. And then number 7, I'd point to the timing of events and the many ironic coincidences that occur throughout the book of Esther, where things seemingly to be unrelated to what's going on suddenly become very important in the story. And you remember the very night before Haman came in to ask for Mordecai's head was the night that the king couldn't sleep, and read about that event when Mordecai had delivered the king, and Haman came in the next day and the king said, how shall we honor him? I mean, the timing of that was just so perfect in how these things came about. That we can see in these events, God must have been here. There are 5 main characters in the book of Esther. You start with King Ahasuerus. I'd call him the incompetent, bumbling king. He never really takes command in all this. He's always asking others what to do and doing what they say. And then there's Vashti, the queen that said no. And then there's Mordecai, the Jew, that faithful citizen that was also faithful to his heritage, and he's a steady all the way through this story. And then there is Esther, his cousin, whom he raised as an orphan. And then there, of course, was wicked Haman himself, who was slain. But there's the other character, the main character, and that is God, who's on every page, whose name is never mentioned. Now with that, I want to go here into an invitation. And I've said this before from the pulpit, and I'll say it again, that I'm always excited when I have a chance to preach. And I know that God's providence is at work. Now, I don't know specifically this, but I know it may be, or perhaps, I'm going to preach this particular lesson that I've prepared at this particular time for someone that is here tonight that needed to hear these things. I never really worry about whether the lesson is relevant to the audience. The Bible is relevant, and I can't tell what's going on in the minds and lives of everyone that's out here listening to me when I preach. But I know to preach His Word and let God's providence do its work. Could be that's you. Could be you're here tonight because something was said that you needed to hear for what's about to happen in your life. And it could be that because of hearing these things, your faith has increased and you need to respond to the gospel. Either to be baptized or to be restored or in some manner ask for the prayers of the church. And so knowing that that could be, at every service we offer the invitation for someone to have that opportunity to make a public response. And that's what we do at this time as we stand and sing the invitation song.